I'm going to continue on in our series in the book of Daniel. This is our third week in a series that we're walking through the Old Testament book of Daniel. I know there might be some of you who, actually there might be part of all of you that wonders at times, what in the world does a 1,000-year-old book about an obscure nation who were taken into captivity and exiled into another nation, what does that have to do with following Jesus, if you're a Jesus follower? What does that have to do with being a Jesus follower in 2018? And the answer to that question, in all sincerity, I believe, is everything. I think it has everything to do with what it means to live our lives today in our culture today. I think the book of Daniel has remarkable application to what it looks like for you and I to try to be people of faith in a culture like the culture we live in today. And I know that might surprise some of you, and my hunch is that for some of you, this series over the next several weeks, and maybe already at the beginning of this series, it's going to serve as a wake-up call. And maybe you've just been surprised by some things or will be surprised. You might be uncomfortable, which is okay. I know for me, sometimes I need to welcome uncomfortable moments and let myself be challenged, and I know that that might happen for some of you in this series. For others of you, this may not be a surprise. Maybe you already know the tension. Maybe you're looking for answers, and I hope that that's what this series provides for you, is legitimate answers for how you live out your faith in our culture today. And I hope it gives you direction, and I hope it shows you how to live. But the question is why? Why is this so relevant? Why is this story so relevant to our story? How in the world is something that's somewhere around 2,623 years old still relevant today? How does this make such a difference? And let me just take us back a little bit, give us some context so that it makes a little bit more sense to us. The year is 605 BC. That's where the book of Daniel really begins. 605 BC, 600 years before the birth of Christ. And the nation, or better known as the empire of Babylon, has conquered the nation of Israel. They've moved into their land. They've laid siege against their capital, the city of Jerusalem. They're carrying away their best and brightest back to their home capital, the city of Babylon. I think it's incredibly important for the application of this series for us to acknowledge and recognize that Babylon is the most powerful nation in the world. That is who they are. It's really critical that we see this, that they are the country with political influence, with military influence. They are the most powerful nation in the world. We need to understand that as we move through this. They're powerful not just because of the current king, a guy named Nebuchadnezzar, but also his father before him, about 15 years before we pick up in this moment, or about 10 years before this, 615 BC. Nebuchadnezzar's father had conquered the Assyrian Empire, which the Assyrians were also a very dominant empire, but his father had conquered the Assyrian Empire and essentially made them this world-dominating kingdom that everybody feared and everybody loathed. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had a different system for conquering people than his father did. His father was known to slay people or enslave people. Nebuchadnezzar took the interesting strategy of assimilation. And we've already talked about this a little bit in this process so far in this series, but he knew that if he could just simply get these people, whoever they were, wherever they were from or whatever they believed, if he could just get these people and turn them into Babylonians, then he had won the intellectual and the heart battle, and he knew that winning the heart and intellectual battle was far more important than winning the physical one. He knew if I could conquer their imaginations, if I can take control of their dreams, if I can get them to think the way I want them to think, then I will ultimately have conquered them, and that is far better than just conquering them in physical terms. And so they instituted a methodology or a system through which they would assimilate captives, particularly the influential captives of these nations, into Babylonian culture, and to a point where they would lose their identity. And so somebody who had come from some nation, someplace, they might still say, well, I'm from Jerusalem. They run into somebody on the streets of Babylon. They say, I'm from Jerusalem. They might say, oh yeah, traditionally my people, myself, we worship the God Yahweh. They might say those things, but ultimately they were Babylonians. In fact, the Babylonians really didn't care if you brought your preferential god of worship to the Babylonian Empire. They didn't care where you were from. You could talk about being from Jerusalem. The point wasn't those things. They wanted you to think, to eat, to live, to act like a Babylonian, to spend your money like a Babylonian, to think like a Babylonian, to find value like a Babylonian. So you could believe whatever you want, but as long as you think like us, well, your beliefs don't really matter. And so people became so Babylonian that while they still might have held on to pieces of who they were so assimilated that they lost their identity. This is why certain events in history have particular relevance a couple thousand years later, right? Are you with me so far? This is why this relates to everything. This is why this has everything to do with everything that you and I are experiencing. You see, the Babylonians, what they did is they leveraged culture to reshape the thinking and the behaviors and ultimately the identities of the people that they were holding in captivity, the people that they conquered. They used culture to do this. Now, when we talk about culture, that's not just like we can go to the mailbox and open up and there's a package of culture that comes. Culture is like a pie with all of these different parts to it. Culture is made up of all of these different elements. It's the arts, it's education, it's institutions, it's entertainment, it's government, it's politics. It's even attitudes and values that become dominant in a particular group of people. All of those things together are what we put under this larger heading of culture. And the Babylonians used culture to reshape identity. Now, just fast forward today. Does that really happen? It does, doesn't it? This, again, is why this is so relevant for us. Of course it happens. In fact, not only do these things shape our identity, not only are they tools that alter who we understand ourselves to be, but many of these just on their own can actually become our identity. I mean, the arts, education, academia, entertainment, media, institutions, politics, values, those things don't just shape us. Sometimes we become these things. This, by the way, is the way of Babylon, and this is why this story needs to take some traction in our lives. Now, I'm going to just create kind of an awkward moment this morning. It's been awkward in all the services, some of them more awkward than others, and I'm getting better at awkward the longer we go through the day, so welcome to the fourth service. But I want you to take a moment right now, and I want you to consider all of these aspects of culture that I just mentioned. I want you to think about all these dynamics, these tools that we would call culture, and I want you to think about them as they are today. I don't want you to think of them in the context of a Christian nation. That is a myth. We do not live in a Christian nation. That's a myth that some people are still trying to believe, but it's not true. And it's important we understand that if we're going to be an influential minority. Don't think about these things in reference to how you would like them to be. Don't think about these things as how they existed 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years ago. I want you to think about the cultural moment that we find ourselves in now. In this moment, I want you to think about these things. I want you to think about art in this moment. And I want you to think about education, academia, right now in this moment. And think about entertainment, think about music, think about media today, right now. Think about institutions. Think about politics, government in this moment. Think about cultural values and how we find meaning and purpose right now in our culture. When we think about these things right now, consider them as tools shaping your identity. Let me ask you this question. In general, are these things helping you identify as a follower of Jesus, or are they hurting you as you identify as a follower of Jesus? If these are tools that are shaping you, if these are forces that are influencing you, if these are dynamics that are helping you form your identity, are the things that I just described, the art, the culture, the government, the institutions, the politics, all of these things, is it helping you be more, are they helping you become more of a Jesus person or less of a Jesus person? There's no neutral ground with this. Are they helping you or hurting you? I told you it'd be awkward, right? Are you starting to see how relevant this seeming irrelevant text can become at the snap of a finger? We live in a culture that is shaping us, and I'm not sure that it's shaping us to become more like the image that Jesus has for most of us, the dream that Jesus has laid out for us, the picture that he's given us, the promise that he's promised us. I don't know that our culture is helping us fulfill those promises or become those people. Now, when this happens, you got to do something. In fact, all of you right now in the tent, would you just take a deep breath, just go, because now you're like, well, what do we do then, right? Okay, I created you're all like, we got to do something about it. So there's three different things we do to this. When this happens, there are three different responses that we have. And the first response, we've seen this throughout history. The first response is you run and hide. The way you preserve your identity, you see the forces of culture, and you go, well, we can't survive this, so let's run and hide. And we become monks, or We buy large tracts of land in North Idaho. We buy chain link and dogs and AK-47s, right? And we run to the hills and we go, I'm going to live here and get all my friends and family that agree with me, and we're just going to hide out here, right? Not everybody does that. Just a few people in North Idaho. But there are a lot of people who still live this mentality out, right? They say, okay, wait a second, I can't run off to the hills, and I don't have the money for the land or the chain link, but what if I could create a Christian subculture? What if I could remove myself in every practical way from the culture around me? What if I could not be involved in anything in my community? What if I could not be involved in my neighborhood or my schools? What if I could just remove everything out and we could pull ourselves, retract ourselves from all of these negative influences and create some sort of Christian subculture, a bubble in which my kids don't have to hear the music or the messages, and I don't have to be influenced by the people, and I'll hang out and I'll listen to Christian music and read Christian books with Christian people in Christian yoga classes, in Christian this, and right? And we create this subculture and say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to hide, and that way I can retain my identity. I'll have no influence on culture, but at least I'll have my identity intact. That's strategy number one. Strategy number two is really the strategy of no strategies. It is the byproduct of not having a strategy. So strategy number two is just simply saying, I'm a part of culture, and by the way, isn't culture just culture? I mean, do I really have control over culture? Isn't culture just who we are collectively? And don't we just sort of define truth as a collective majority? And so whatever culture is what is true. And so I'm just going to let culture define me. So that's option number two. We're absorbed by culture and we lose our identity. One season of my life, I was an athlete. I know nothing about me tells you that today, but at one season of my life, I was an athlete in high school and in college. And during that season, I had somewhere between 8 to 12 practices every single week. I just recently told my daughter, I said I wasn't really that good of a kid when I was in high school and college. I was just too busy to be bad. That was really what it was all about. So I mean, I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I went to practice, and I went to school, and then I went to practice till 7:30 at night, and then I did my homework, and I went to bed, and that was my cycle. And I lived, and I breathed, and I ate, and I slept my sport. That was it. That was all I did. And then in college, I decided to quit that sport and walk away, and I literally had these crisis moments when I would run into people, and for so much of my life, I had spent so much time in this bubble, in this place, in this culture of my sport, that when they said, hey, what do you do? I did not know how to answer them. In fact, during that season, I just started gaining a bunch of weight, eating lots of cheeseburgers. And so I was like, I guess I'm a professional cheeseburger eater at this point. Like, McDonald's loves me these days. That's all. I did not know who I was. I was so much a part of this that my identity had been absorbed and stripped from me, and all I was this thing that I did. That's strategy number two. We don't really have a response. We just sort of lean into culture, and we just become what culture makes us. But then there's a third option, and there's a third way, and this third way is so beautiful. It's so beautiful, and it's so compelling. In fact, it's the image that Daniel is giving us through his story. The third way is that we engage culture. We live in our neighborhoods. We develop friendships. We work for justice and mercy. We live full lives, and we retain our identity as followers of Jesus. There is a third way to live, and it isn't pulling away, and it isn't just becoming absorbed. It's this balance. It's this third way of living in the in-between, where we don't become the cultural wallpaper, but yet we live these full lives in culture and distinctly Christian. That's what Daniel is revealing to us. He's answering the question, how do we live out our faith in a pluralistic, polytheistic world? That's the world he lived in. Pluralistic, lots of different religions. Polytheistic, lots of different gods. That's exactly where we live today. How do we live this out? We look at the story of Daniel because it's recalibrating our thinking and hopefully recalibrating our lives so that we align with the story of God, so that our story's trajectory, the narrative that we are telling with our own lives, is the same story that God is telling about his people. That's why we look at this story. In other words, how do we live as an influential minority? So chapter 1 introduces us to this whole concept. If you've been here the past couple of weeks, not much of what I just said was new to you. This whole idea of assimilation, we saw that in chapter 1. And we saw that Daniel and his friends have been carried off, and they've made this decision to say, okay, we're going to be third way kind of people. We're going to live out a different reality. We're going to do this. Last week, if you were here, John did a masterful job. I told him this morning, almost too masterful. He makes it hard to come back and preach sometimes. I'm like, can you be a little worse when I'm gone? Like, just You make me look bad. But he did a great job of ending chapter 1, bringing us to chapter 2. And chapter 1 ends with the Daniel and his friends being elevated. They have favor with the king and with the people as a result of choosing to live as an influential minority. They make the decision to be different, and yet they are elevated. That was the point, one of the things we saw last week. Now we come to chapter 2, and some time has passed, and we read this. And this is what I'm going to do this morning. I'm just going to read some of these texts, and we're just going to draw a few principles, not necessarily closely connected, but principles that I think are applicable to those of us trying to live as exiles in a Babylonian-like culture today. Sound good? All right, about 90% of you are with me, 10%. That's not bad. Chapter 2, verse 1 says this: In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. He had insomnia. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. And so they came in, and they stood before the king. The king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. And the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and then the interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb and your houses will be laid to ruins. This is kind of what kings do, right? So the king's having this reoccurring dream. In case you don't realize what's happening, he's having this dream and he wants the dream interpreted. But the catch is he's not going to let anybody interpret the dream based on him telling them, you have to tell me what I dreamt, then tell me the interpretation for what I dreamt. Makes lots of sense. Doesn't sound difficult at all. Right? Or does it? It sounds impossible, right? Like impossible. Now, I think it's brilliant on Nebuchadnezzar's part because he knows all of these magicians and wise individuals, they can say whatever they want. They can make something up. And he's like, no, truly, if you want to do this and you really think you can, you're going to show me that you know what you're talking about. So tell me my dream. What did I dream about? Pretty difficult, which is why in verse 11, the wise men say this: the thing that the king asks is difficult. Right? So, I mean, they see what we see. Really? You're asking us to do this? And then they say this: no one can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. Now, this is reflective of a couple of different things that I think are important. Last week, John unpacked the idea or the story of the Assyrian or Babylonian creation story, and this reflects that belief system, that the gods would never be involved with us. They're out there, we're down here, and so there's a reflection of what they believe, but there's also a truth that they're proclaiming in this. There's no way this is going to happen without God. That's actually right, isn't it? Let me just tell you, if somebody comes up to you and tells you what you dreamt last night, we can be pretty confident that God gave them that, right? That's not something that normal people do, right? Like none of us are going to walk up tomorrow and go, hey, by the way, can I tell you what you dreamt last night? And, oh, sure, that's just a normal thing. No, God does that sort of thing, right? So they see this, like this doesn't happen apart from God working. And so they're right about this. The problem is that being right doesn't necessarily make the king happy, which is why we get verse 12. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious. If you translate, by the way, the very furious, the Hebrew language to English, it's through a tantrum. It's not. You guys are like, really? No, but I just picture the king like throwing a fit, right? He just throws a fit. He's on the floor. He's banging his hands and fists. And it says he commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So that's how you deal with problems when you're a king. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought out Daniel and his companions to kill them. And the deal is that Daniel and his friends, because of their notoriety, because of how they had risen in influence, are now on the executioner's list of wise men to be killed. So, by the way, let me just pause for a second. This is the way of Babylon. I think we all need to accept this. The way of Babylon is that they assimilate you. They want you to be a part of their thinking, part of their ways. They're going to use you. But when you stop being useful, they discard you. You're worthless. So the goal of Babylon is we're going to use you. We're going to leverage you. We're going to get you in here. We're going to make the most of whatever you have. But the moment that you stop being useful to the ways, to the thinking, to the efforts of Babylon, well, then we're going to render you useless and we are going to kick you to the curb, or in this case, take your life. We're going to eliminate you. That's the way of Babylon. But we read on in verse 14. It says, Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion, which is what you do when your life is on the line. Prudence and discretion. to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree of the king so urgent? Like, why do you have to kill us today? And then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel, and Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. So Daniel hears the story and says, wait, we're going to die because nobody's been able to tell the king what he's been dreaming and what the dream means? Well, if we're going to die for that, would somebody get me an appointment with the king? Because I'll do that. Which sounds like a bunch of bravado, right? Like, wait a second, he's going to step up into this moment. It's like David and Goliath. He's going to step into this and say, how dare you? Like, I'm going to go take care of this. So get me an appointment with the king. I'm going to be there. Let's take care of this. It seems like a bold move until you move to verse 17. And it says, then Daniel went home, went to his house, and he made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, his companions. And he told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So basically, he goes home and goes, guys, I made an appointment, and I'm going to tell the king his dream, but I have no idea what I'm going to say. Could we pray together? Would you guys mind joining me in some time of prayer? And let's ask God to reveal the mystery of the universe right now. Like, this is kind of pressing, right? But then we read verse 19, and guys, this is where the power of the story begins to take root for us, and it's taking root. It's challenging me in this cultural moment. It says, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. And then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. If you read on from that verse on, there's this prayer, there's this time of worship where Daniel just praises God for revealing this mystery to him. So he goes to his friends and he asks them to pray, and then God reveals it to him. He gives him eyes to see and he gives him ears to hear in a moment when he couldn't see and he couldn't hear. Suddenly God gives him the vision. God gives him what he needed. This is something I want you to catch today if you're a Jesus follower. And I know not everybody in the room is, but if you're a Jesus follower and you're going, yeah, how do I live in Babylon? Like, what's distinct about me? How do I do this when it's so easy to get caught up in culture? Let me tell you something we see here. That God will give you the ability to see and speak in a culture that is blind and mute. As a Jesus follower, you are not subject to everything that everybody else is. You are not just living blindly based on the cultural influences around you. You are not limited to those influences. God gives you the ability to see things that other people don't see, to speak truths that other people aren't speaking, to offer wisdom and insight and guidance, to be a force of influence in your culture, in a culture that doesn't see, in a culture that is blind, in a culture that doesn't hear God. You have the ability to see and hear things that other people don't. And I don't know if it's because we're tired from fighting the cultural wave or the tides of Babylon, or whether we've started to be absorbed into the culture, but somehow we have largely lost the sense that God gives us words. We've lost the sense that God gives us vision in a culture that has none. We've lost the sense that the people of God were created not just to survive and get through, and that Jesus didn't come just to be a life preserver as you're sinking on the oceans, but that Jesus came that we would thrive and that we would be an influence in the culture around us. We've lost this sense. In fact, when you look at the characteristics of the people of God through history, when you look at the people of God, whether it's in the Old Testament or the New Testament, you always see they had this capacity to see and hear things differently than the culture that was dominant around them. That is always their characteristic. Sometimes simple wisdom, sometimes it was unique moments like Daniel, but there was this capacity to see and hear and speak things that were different than culture. In fact, when you read about the most vibrant expressions of the church, and I'm not talking just about the book of Acts. We read about this in the book of Acts in the Bible. When you read about it through the last 2,000 years of church history, the most vibrant expressions of the church, when the church has thrived and when it's influenced and when it's shaped culture around and when people have found purpose in their lives, it has been characterized by people who understood there was a supernatural element of sight and a supernatural element of prophetic voice. There's something that they had in them. There's something that they understood, that they could see what others don't see and they could say what others weren't saying because God had given them those words. By and large, I think Babylon has stripped us, even stripped me of my confidence. Babylon asks you and I to play by its rules. You can't see and hear things we don't see and hear. And by the way, we don't see and hear anything, so just do what we tell you. God has given us the ability to see and to speak. Amen? Which means this. It also means this. There's an implication for every one of us in the room. God has you where he has you when he has you for a reason. Are you with me? Does that make sense to you? God has you where he has you, when he has you, for a reason. You aren't where you are simply so that you can get by, simply so that you can survive. You are not where you are in life. There is no such thing as a holding pattern when you are among the people of God. There's no spot where you go, yeah, I don't know, I'm just kind of in this in-between season. I'm not really going to do much. This is just kind of here right now. No, you are where you are for a reason, so that you can be an influence, so that you can see, so that you can speak, so that you can encourage, so that you can come alongside, so that you can intervene in moments of crisis, so that you can bring justice, so you can bring peace, so that you can bring joy. That's where you are. And I know what you're thinking. Now you're thinking, well, you don't know where I am right now, Brad. You don't know that, like, I made a bunch of mistakes recently, and I don't really feel like the kind of person who has the right to do that. Well, actually, I know where you are because I've been there. And I know you say things, oh, you know what, if I had a little bit more Bible knowledge and came to church like another 365 times, then maybe I could do this, right? Or you say, you don't know how tired I am. I just need a nap. Anybody else just need a nap? I feel that way all the time these days. It's like an age thing. I just want a nap. Eat dinner at 4. You say, I'm not in the best place right now. You know, I feel like if there's another season, it's a better season. Can I just tell you? Daniel didn't have that luxury, did he? Imagine how they feel. Like, it's not like they're firing on all 8 cylinders. They are up against the wall. Their limbs are going to be torn from their body. Not exactly the best time. And they don't actually have the information that they think they should have, right? But they have a God who will give it to them. They just see themselves in a position of influence. They see themselves, no matter where they are, there's just this sense of, you know what, everybody else is doing their thing, but for some reason we're here. We don't have the answers, but God does. And so because we're here, we're just going to step into this situation differently than all the people around us. And they do that. God has you where he has you for a reason. And some of the most vulnerable, insecure moments that you find yourself in are the moments that God is going to step in and give you words to say and vision to expand on. God has you where you are for a reason. And by the way, if it was about feeling like you have it all together to be that person of minority influence, none of us would ever do it. We need God. Let's keep reading. Verse 25 says, Then Arioch brought Daniel before the king in haste and said thus to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. The king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, because it's easier to say, Are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? Can you do both of these, Daniel? Can you tell me the dream and the interpretation? And Daniel answered the king and said, No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked, but, I love this, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Then he goes on, he says, and he's made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days, what's going to come after this moment. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be after this. And he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. But as for me, the mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have, any more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation might be made known to the king. So he's saying, I don't take credit for this. God showed me this so that you would know what's going to come after this. Then in verse 31, he says, this is the dream that he had. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. Imagine the tension in this moment, by the way. I hope I'm right. But it seems specific enough that maybe he is. He says, you saw and behold a great image, and this image, mighty and exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, the middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken into pieces and became like the chaff of the summer on the threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And I know what you're thinking. You know exactly what's happening here, right? No. Most of us read this and you go, what in the world is this about, right? In fact, you're not the first people to ask, and a lot of people have asked and wondered what this really means. And if you were here in week 1, you know we talked about speculative theology and that we're not going to spend a lot of time doing that in the book of Daniel. We spend our time thinking about what could be and should be, not what might be. But let me just explain this dream that Daniel is explaining because it's incredibly powerful. Most scholars look at the statue and understand this as an illustration of the various kingdoms of the world that would come after Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar, it talks about this head of gold. The head of gold is his kingdom, the Babylonian Empire. Then there's the silver chest and arms, and that's another empire, and then the bronze middle and thighs, and then the iron legs, and then the iron clay and feet and toes is the last part of this. Each one of these are understood to line up with a particular empire or kingdom that has existed in the world. Now, this is 605 BC, and we're at the very beginning of this. He has this dream. We have this incredible privilege now from our historical perspective to look back, and we actually can see with pretty distinct clarity where all of these kingdoms start and begin. It is this unbelievable privilege we have that, if nothing else, I think causes us to trust God at a new level because we just see this in all of its fullness, like somehow back then God could just see the nations lining out and all of these kingdoms led by men in all of these different times. Now, side note, for some of you, just so that some of you don't know this, but some people get really lost in the weeds in the book of Daniel because they believe that the feet and the toes part hasn't happened yet. And so they spend a lot of time trying to figure out, well, which kingdom is the kingdom of the feet and the toes, which is stinky business. No, just bad joke. It's like total dad joke, sorry. But they think this. They think if we can figure that out, if we know what nation that is, then we can predict the future, and then we can tell people when the return of Christ is. And then we can make some signs on sticks and get a bullhorn and walk around, like downtown and like scream it, and we can do that thing if we do that, right? By the way, we've been doing that for a couple hundred years now because we don't know. We don't specifically know which kingdom that is. We don't know if it's happened or not happened. We really don't know these things. And so I want to focus on other dimensions because there are other dimensions of this that I still think apply to us in very practical ways. And so let me just share two of these dimensions. First of all, notice this. Notice the base of the statue and how it contrasts the head. The head is of gold. The base, the feet, they are made of clay and iron. What does that mean? Well, it means it's compromised. It's contrast. You have clay and iron as the feet, and you have this gold head. So the base is vulnerable, the head is beautiful. This doesn't make any sense. Why would you build a statue this way, right? No one would build a statue with gold on top and then clay and iron on the bottom. Why would you do this sort of thing? I believe this is one of the reasons why Nebuchadnezzar stays up at night thinking about this. We discover in chapter 3 that Nebuchadnezzar wanted to build a statue for himself. In fact, he had this dream of himself and who he would become. He had an image of who he was becoming. And so he wanted to build this massive statue that would represent his identity. There was this power of a dream of who he would become. And the dream was how people would view him. How are people going to see me as this king, Nebuchadnezzar? He wanted people to see him a certain way. And so he sees this image in this dream, and he sees this head of gold, but then he sees this weak base, and this is troubling. Let me just talk about this for a second. Here's the first way I want you to understand this. You can have a dream for your life. In fact, most of us in this room have a dream for our lives. You can dream that things are going to go a certain way, that you're going to get a certain job, live in a certain place, own a certain house, drive a certain car. You can just have this image. You can have an image of how you want people to think about you and perceive you and treat you. And you start building this life. You start working towards this life. You spend money on making it happen. You spend energy on making it happen. You start crafting this image of a life. And it consists of all these things: what you know, what you own, where you live, how people see you, how people treat you. All of these things form this image that you are working to build that people can see. And by the way, most of us in the room have an image of who we're trying to become. But ultimately, the foundation of that image is all about you. For Nebuchadnezzar, the foundation is all about him and his life and getting what he wanted out of life. For us, it's all about us and getting what we want out of life. And the dream says that that's a weak foundation. Now, the telltale sign that we've built on this foundation is that we're always haunted by our dream falling apart. We're always worrying that the whole thing is going to crumble around us. What we're being told is that the main difference between the Babylonian way and the Jesus way is the foundation. You can be a Christian per se and still have a weak foundation. But let me just tell you this. Uncomplicating the Christian life is as simple as you and I assessing our foundation. What foundation are you building your life on? It may look good, but what's the base of this thing? How do you assess this? I think we assess it with a few questions. Questions like this. Why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you doing this? Whatever it is you're doing, why are you doing this? Whose kingdom are you building? Or whose dazzling self are you trying to present to others? Whose glory are you living for? See, the primary difference between the culture of Babylon and the culture of Jesus is this foundation. Babylon puts you at the center of the story, and that complicates things. And you think you're finding your identity, but you're actually losing your identity. And while you're losing your identity, you're actually increasing in insecurity because you're being held bondage by Babylon. The more you have to support this foundation, the more you have to give in to the ways of Babylon. So why are you doing this? Who are you living for? Whose kingdom are you building? How you answer those questions will define how you're living as a member of this influential minority. I know this isn't easy. Culture is strong. Has anybody ever tried to swim upstream in a river before? Anybody feel like that right now in this talk? Like, yeah, you're right. This is hard. This is tough. How do we do this? How do we find strength? I think that's the beauty that we find in the second part of this dream. Notice the stone. You had the gold, you had the silver, you had the bronze, you had the iron, then you had the clay feet, and then you have this stone. This stone that comes flying in and hits the statue on the feet, which I kick things in the middle of the night all the time. Like, there's no worse painful image, right? You can almost see the bubble of curse words above the statue in this moment. Like, why the feet? Why did you have to hit the feet? But notice this stone. This stone is also a kingdom. All of these things are kingdoms, right? Everything being mentioned in the dream is a kingdom, and now you have this other kingdom. But notice that this kingdom is not carved out with human hands. What does this mean? Well, it means it's not a kingdom like any of the other kingdoms. It is not an earthly kingdom carved out by the hands of men. It is a different kind of kingdom, and when this kingdom enters the scene, it strikes the base, and everything else crumbles, and it is what remains. And so we read on in verse 44, and Daniel says, "In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, the interpretation is true. There is a new kingdom, a kingdom that is coming." In 605 BC, Daniel is telling Nebuchadnezzar, what you have dreamt about is the kingdom that is to come, and it is the kingdom of Jesus that would begin and enter the world in 600 years. So cosmically, we can understand this as there being a kingdom that is above and different than all other kingdoms, but individually, there is a foundation that is stronger than all other foundations. So how do we live as exiles in Babylon? How do we live as people living a distinct life, this third way, fully engaged? Well, we are strengthened, we are made powerful, we are sustained when we live for the kingdom of tomorrow rather than the kingdom of right now. How do you get through today? How do you live with the changing cultural tides? How do you find strength in this world? When we look to and we're reminded of the kingdom of Jesus, that there is this other kingdom. I mean, isn't that brilliant that 600 years before the arrival of Jesus, we have a text that perfectly describes what Jesus would do as he began to usher this in? And by the way, as we look now at the 2,000 years of human history, it's following Daniel chapter 2 to a T. The kingdoms have risen and kingdoms have fallen, but this mountain has been forming of the kingdom of Jesus. If you would have told people at the time of Christ that the Roman Empire would someday be wiped off the planet, that would barely even exist as just this small little nation, and that somehow the kingdom of Jesus would be established and that all the world there would be people that would be worshiping him, no one would have ever believed you, except for those that read Daniel chapter 2. As the mountain of who Jesus is and his kingdom begins to increase in influence and force. Jesus continues to prevail, and the people that live in his kingdom continue to flourish. And let me just tell you, when I see this, and then I see the choices that I have to make, and by the way, I wrestle with all this stuff the same way you do, the stuff that I try to use to leverage identity out of it, the places where I seek glory, the questions about whose kingdom I'm building. When I see this and I see those choices, it becomes incredibly simple. Amen? I'm going to live for the kingdom of stone that puts all these other kingdoms to shame, the one that is and the one that is to come. Let me just close with this. I want to close with the last bit of this story from chapter 2 because I think most of us have believed a lie about what happens when you live the third way out. Babylon has told you and it's told me that if you really press into this and you really try to live out as this third way in culture, if you try to engage and retain your identity, that you're going to be an outcast, that you'll be discarded, that you'll be a freak, that you'll become irrelevant. That's what we've been told by Babylon. But notice what happens at the end of chapter 2. In verse 46 it says, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, 'Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery.'" And check this out. "Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts and made him ruler over the province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king and appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but David remained in the king's court." When David was running back to his house and saying, "Guys, we better pray," did you ever imagine the outcome would be this? I don't know what situation you find yourself in, but whatever spot you find yourself in, you are where you are for the purpose of influence. God has placed you in the place that you are so that you could see things that other people don't see and say things that other people aren't saying, so that you could be a force for his kingdom wherever you find yourself. And I know that in that moment, even when I say this right now, you're like, "I don't know, not me," and you're backed into the corner. Would you just imagine, first of all, what happens with Daniel? And then secondly, would you imagine the kingdom that is to come, the stone that turns to a mountain that puts all these other kingdoms to shame? And would you be encouraged by this? Sound good? Sounds kind of challenging? Anybody up for a challenge? Would you stand with me? May you see what others don't see, and may you say what this culture will not say. May you be men and women who live not for yourselves, but base your lives on the foundation of who Jesus is and his kingdom. May you live and find strength in the kingdom that is to come, not this mess that we find ourselves in now. Amen? Amen. Have a great week this week. Let's live this out. Next Sunday, Daniel chapter 3. We'll see you then.